The 1960s were a time of intense political activity and organizing in the U.S., but not everyone has received their fair share of attention or had their history documented. In a new book, academic and historian Premilla Nadasen covers the forgotten history of activism of African American domestic workers from the 1950s through the 1970s. Often left out by organized labor, Black women working as nannies, house cleaners, and more took matters into their own hands and established an identity as a labor force. In her book, Household Workers Unite, the Untold Story of African American Women Who Built a Movement, Nadasen profiles many of the leaders and members of this movement to give them their rightful place in the labor history of the U.S. Premilla Nadasen is an associate professor of history at Barnard College at Columbia University, and her earlier book was entitled Welfare Warriors, the Welfare Rights Movement in the United States. Welcome to Uprising.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Now, you invoked in your book the film The Help to illustrate how Black domestic workers have traditionally been seen as without agency, until they were sort of sparked by outsiders. How prevalent is this myth today, and how wrong is it?
I think the myth is very prevalent today, and we can open up a newspaper on any given day and read stories about domestic workers who've been essentially imprisoned in their homes, who've been mistreated. Some of these workers are undocumented, some are not, but they're relatively powerless compared to their employers. And so I think those stories of vulnerability, those stories of disempowerment really dominate the discourse about household workers. And it's one that was also very much a part of the novel and the book, The Help, where domestic workers were clearly exploited and mistreated, but their ultimate the ultimate exposure of their story came from a white protagonist, a young white woman who decided to put their stories down on paper. And the domestic workers themselves in that story are really in the background. And it's interesting because in my historical research in the archives, I found quite the opposite was true, that domestic workers in the 1960s were very active and were mobilized and were organizing.